So, and those of you who know me will know already, my name's Jane Stewart. I've been delivering some of the programme, and I'm based up in Scotland, but excited to be with you electronically down south. Today, we have a guest talking a little bit about strategy and leadership for small organisations. Russell Findlay, welcome to the Active Vets programme of learning. Would you be all right to just do a little bit of an introduction and explain a little bit about the work you do and why you think we've asked you here?
Sure. So, as Jane says, I'm Russell Findlay. I'm currently Chief Exec of what I think of as a small charity, Speakers Trust. We're an education charity that helps young people build their confidence and communication skills. But for the 15 years before this role, I worked in sport like all of you. I've been Chief Exec of a number of sports charities, from Fulham Football Club's foundation through to London Youth Games, which was possibly my career highlight, but also where I got to meet Jane the first time. Or the second time, actually, I lied. I'd worked, we'll touch on this, in large versus small organisations, met her at the LTA, recruited her into London Youth Games. She's a stickler for being precise. Apologies for my mistake.
Only because it reflects a large part of our relationship working at London Youth Games, which is, and maybe Russell will touch a little bit on the massive shock when you move from one organisation to another. So we're here to talk about small organisations specifically, which I know you're incredibly passionate about. And I know you're very active in the small charity world as well. Like, I've seen you comment, you're always on LinkedIn talking about what we need to be thinking about in terms of leading responsibly and things like that. What we'd love is, would you mind just telling us a little bit about your experiences of leading small organisation and why you think it's different to working in larger organisations?
Yeah, I mean, the very first small organisation I had a leadership role in was back in the dot-com boom days in the 1990s. And I worked with a couple of friends who came out consulting in in an organisation called ReallyMoving.com. It was a property business. It generated cash quickly and lived on to this day. I came out of PwC. PwC is a giant multinational organization, and I was doing corporate strategy for other really large organizations. And that little taste of startup culture for me was, I guess, what defined the rest of my career. The biggest difference, and I sum it up as being in that sort of nautical way of two different boats. In a large organization, you are either on an oil tanker or an ocean liner. There is tons of things going on, loads of really excellent, skilled people doing quite specific roles. In a small organization, it's more like a speedboat. You are doing everything yourself, and you are hit by the weight of these ocean liners constantly. So you're bouncing around all over the place. So for me, the biggest difference is how close you are to the action, the team spirit you can build up within the group of people who can clearly see the impact they're having in a charity perspective on their beneficiaries. And the final thing that I think is really important is just the limited resources that you have. I mean, I always joke that the person who is head of IT this month is the person who managed to fix the printer. And in the other room, someone is genuinely trying to do that right now.
And that, I have to say, that has gone with me through my entire career. Russell and I worked together a while ago now, a few years ago. That joke we still say in my current organisation, because we're only three. Whoever fixes the printer, whoever solves the printing problem, head of IT for the rest of the season. So it's definitely, I don't know, definitely just something that has stuck with me. And I think that, well, I'm working with a scale up at the moment. It's gone from 20 to 100. And the difference in having people who can do lots of things okay versus having specialists, it's been really interesting to watch people deal with, even the leaders, because the leaders aren't specialists in anything. They've just figured out how to drive something forward. we're always really interested in these conversations about personal motivation. So we love hearing a little bit about how, and you talked a little bit about that taste you got of sort of startup culture and why that drove you. But it'd be lovely to understand a little bit about how your personal journey has ended up with you as CEO of your current organization. And you've been there a few years now, I think. Like, what keeps you motivated in a small organization?
Yeah, so I've had two careers, is the way I describe it. So I was in the corporate sector for some time as a strategy consultant. It was an awesome experience. Got to travel the world and work with some incredibly talented people. And cutting the story relatively short, there was a moment I was at a conference, a technology conference in New Orleans, and I just didn't really want to network with the people who were there. And it was nothing about them as individuals. I just didn't have a passion for how we could get faster and faster broadband through electricity pylons. And I'm sure there's people on the call who can empathize with that view. So I had a moment that I wanted to change careers and I wanted to work in something where I could get up on Monday morning and feel passionate about the difference I was making. So I made a switch into the sports sector. And to be honest, at that point, it was the sports sector was something new to me. The voluntary sector was something brand new to me. And I was finding my feet on what I wanted to do. And the easiest transition was to work for another organization that had a load of resources that needed strategic support. And that's when I started working at the LTA. And there were a number of change management programs that were going on. I also had the real benefit of, I guess, caretaker manager of a few different departments. So I got to see every aspect of, I guess, what is a relatively large governing body. But I still wanted to do two things. I wanted to do something where the impact I was having could be tangibly seen straight away, so closer to the action. And then I wanted to use sport, and the motivation for working in sport was to use sport as a tool for social change. And that's when I took the opportunity to lead Fulham Football Club's foundation, which was an incredibly exciting moment. It was incredibly stressful and I learned loads as well. It was back in the days where Fulham were toying with relegation permanently. And we, at one point, were 501 to on to go down. So almost certainly going to go down half time at a game against Man City away. It was the year of the Great Escape for Fulham Football Club. But what I learned about managing a small charity where things that were completely out of your control were going to dictate your future. If we'd been relegated, the charity was going to be of a massively different scale. So 11 men wearing white t-shirts standing on a football pitch were dictating the future of what we did. And the learning I had through that period is a thing that really taught me a lot about managing people in adversity. Roll on through a really exciting period at London Youth Games, which was revitalising what I still think of as a real jewel in the crown of the London sporting scene, and growing that to its real potential. I wanted to step out of sport and I wanted to take some of the lessons about what sport could do in the education sector and get closer to learning and understanding that. So I took on this role leading, again, a small organisation through a period of what has proven to be growth and quite a lot of turmoil within working with schools across the country.
Brilliant, thank you. And obviously we're talking, and we've been talking quite a lot about leadership and leading people throughout the whole program. And it definitely varies people to people, but for you, what's the hardest bit? What's the hardest bit of being the leader?
I think if I were to sum it up in one word, the hardest bit for me is consistency. I talk about the speedboat analogy, and working in a small organization, you are buffeted by the wake. You can work really quickly you can change direction, but also you need to be very responsive to what's changing around you. So, like many of the people on the call, COVID was a massive shift for us, and we needed to move really, really quickly. But equally, if your biggest funder is on the phone and wants a conversation or something drastic is happening. So in the world I inhabit now, the Israel-Palestine issue is something young people wish to speak about, and we need to manage the safeguarding and well-being aspects of that. So you get pulled off what you want to do and what you're trying to achieve by developing the strategy of the organization to being incredibly responsive and reactive. And therefore being consistent in what you are giving your attention to. And you're very visible as a leader. And how you role model that consistency of focus and consistency of performance, I think is really challenging when you don't have people you can point to take over the lead of things.
Interesting. I've literally just come off a session talking about organization culture and how two of the biggest influences on how people experience and think about their work is like what leaders do and what leaders pay attention to. So like, what are they spending their time and their energy on, as well as what are they actually doing? You mentioned consistency is the hardest thing for you. How do you deal with that? What are your top tips? What's the Russell top tip of actually attempting to be more consistent than normal?
So the danger of being really honest on this interview is I don't have this one solved. I wish I'd now come up with something as my answer that actually I smash week in, week out. I think having a culture where mistakes happen, where people are human and recognizing that we're all human is probably the first thing. So my hope is that the team around me can see that if I'm not consistent, then that's just another part of having a human being as a boss. The other part is that refocusing. One of the best training courses I ever went on was, I'll give it a name check, but how to be a productivity ninja. So there's a company called Think Productive who do time management. And part of the process that they talk about is having a review period weekly. And when I first started working remotely, that was in my coffee shop, local to my house. It was a different environment. And it was a chance to move through those tasks that you've got today, but then the next level of programs or projects you're trying to achieve, and then connect that back up to what is it I am actually trying to do this year? And what is it that our key strategic objectives are? And I think that helps you go through that focus, like, what am I actually trying to achieve? Is everything I'm doing the best way of doing it? How better can I focus my time and attention? I fall off the wagon. I don't do it every week. But trying to instill a discipline to make that happen for me is something that really helps me.
Yeah, and I think you make a really interesting point. I remember making a mistake in my, I want to say, first 6 months. I mean, I made loads of mistakes way earlier than that, but there was one in particular. I made a really, what I considered to be quite a bad mistake. And I was really upset. When I worked with Russell, I worked with Russell for 6 or 7 years, and I was in the stage of my life where I was quite good at what I did, but I also made mistakes like we all do and didn't really deal with it very well. And I remember thinking that I was going to have to quit, because I'd ordered the wrong shuttlecocks, which always makes me laugh, right? So, and in fact, I hadn't even done it. Someone else, our supplier, had ordered the wrong shuttlecocks, and I hadn't checked them, even though I'd asked for the right ones. And all I'd done is not opened the box, right? 3 months ago when they turned up, I'd just gone, oh, I'm going to assume it's right. And I remember thinking I was going to quit and bursting into tears. And I don't cry easily on Russell. And Russell was like, okay, mistakes happen. It's how we deal with the mistakes that says more about us than what we do. So what are we going to do? And so for me, I think there's something really interesting about like this idea of we're humans first. Like, we're humans first when we show up to work, and you can't just, for all of the productivity tips and tools, you're just going to get better, but you're still going to have to work at it. And I find that both really inspiring, but also really challenging. But it's not like, it's not like ordering shuttlecocks, right? I can order the shuttlecocks, I get the right ones, then it's sorted. If you struggle with consistency, or if you struggle with empathy, or if you struggle with maths or whatever it is, it's always going to be a little bit of a challenge to improve it as a leader, but you just have to keep working at it. And I love that idea. I think it's really, really important. What which I guess says a little bit about what I think is a good strategic leader, which is someone who kind of understands their sort of strengths and weaknesses. For you, what do you think makes a good strategic leader, particularly in smaller organizations?
Yeah, I think it might build on that. I think the first comment I'd make to that is there's no cookie cutter blueprint. We all bring our different strengths to it. And there's some things within leadership or within management that I have a lot of experience in more than the average person in my role, but there's also areas where I don't. And I talked before about making the transition into the voluntary sector. I had a lot to learn on day one. And that sense of why doesn't everybody just do it? And understanding the nuances of relationships. So the first point I would make is that there is no perfect leader. I think the bit that really distinguishes a small charity or a small organization to larger organizations is resourcefulness. And I think you start from that about building a team around you that can compensate. So you talk about, I guess, emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, and understanding your strengths and weaknesses. And that starts with, I think, having that humility of knowing that you will be called on to do a lot, but how can you build, however small a team you have, around you and compensate? And that might not be just staff, but how can you find the right board support? How can you find the right mentors? How can you tap into those people who have greater strengths than you do in certain areas and can give you great advice? And so I think if I were to characterize the difference in leadership between a large charity or a large organization and a small one, is you have to have greater resourcefulness in getting to the right answer, even though you may not have all the resources to hand to deliver that within your organization.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting. I work with someone who works at a large his background is a large organization now, and I think the advice we give leaders about flexing the team and the practices to suit them in comparison to fitting a bigger picture in a larger organization where people can move around and people can be promoted, and designing roles that fit the person that you've got that's the right fit for you is a much more complex thing, I think. And it's one of the reasons I get frustrated that a lot of the resources for charities and small organizations, small charities and small organizations and small businesses are derived from big organizations. And so they don't necessarily have that flex that you need to be able to make the most of what you've got and make the sum of the parts more than the individual. And I think it's that building of a team that works. And the problem is every time someone leaves with a small org, it's not as straightforward, because you then have to shift all the pieces and all the roles to make sure that you can still have a gap that is fillable by someone that actually exists, which I think is hugely challenging. So the number
That's also for me. Sorry, I was going to say
Yeah,
that's incredibly motivating. You asked before, like, what keeps me motivated in that role? That is the exciting piece of the puzzle to continue to solve. It's never solved, and it's all at much more of a human scale. So we've got someone heading off on maternity cover, and yes, I want to fill that specific role, but also we've got a small team. We've got 10 people on payroll at the moment. It's like, what does that mean for every single individual, and how can we see this as an opportunity for each of them? Whereas I think if I scale up and you've got somebody going on maternity leave, it's just over to HR to fill the gap. And you're looking for a like for like replacement. And the sense for everybody else is, I'm reporting into somebody for a period of time. That I think the really exciting thing about small organizations is the ability to make change with people at a human scale within your organization, and to see the outcome of your work from your beneficiaries, from your customers, from your clients, however you refer to them.
Yeah, I think like it's such a good point around that recruitment puzzle. Because we design our HR processes for big organizations. And I know I go on about this, but like, so there's a system and a process. But the reality is when you sit in an interview, quite often in a small organization, you're thinking, how is this person going to do that job? And is there something I'm missing about how that job can exist that I can then meet that person because I think they could be valuable to the organization? And that puzzle is why that recruitment process is so complex for small organizations, because it, you know, when you've got an organization with 1,000 people doing the same job, by then you've figured out what a good person looks like, right? You this for that job. Whereas when you're a small organization, because it changes every time, it's just so much more interesting, but it's harder.
I think also where they can take the job changes. So you see someone and you go through that interview process and you're like, I didn't actually see that potential of taking the job that way. And so I think, you know, without giving the impression that all recruitment for small organizations is pure chaos and people land in the role, is there are things people can bring to a job that you maybe didn't see that could be transformational for your charity or transformational for your small organization, because their impact in that organization proportionately is just going to be massive.
Yeah. And it's why it makes it a bit more risky, I think, as well, because if you get it wrong, it can really knock the entire organization rather than just one part of it. Strategy and planning, variously my favorite and then not favorite topic at London Youth Games, depending on my mood. You obviously have spent a long time thinking about different strategies and different plans for different teams and different organizations. Where are you now on what makes a good strategy or a good strategic plan? What do you, what's the hallmarks for you where you go, yeah, that feels like a really good way of approaching this?
Okay, I think the hardest thing that I found moving from a role for the first part of my career where we developed corporate strategy into organizations that need to have a strategy to deliver to work, it's just no one defines strategy as the same thing. And so people talk at cross purposes. There's a real blur between just getting stuff done and what a strategy is. And it feels more abstract, and people want to, everybody aspires to do stuff that's more strategic. And I think, in a sense, the word becomes unhelpful. Every organization has a strategy. It's just whether they are deliberately choosing it. So the first thing, I think it's really useful to have an idea of where you're going to go. And this is where I think people tend to spend a lot of time focusing on wordsmithing their mission or vision statement. That to me is, you know, one part of a strategy. It's useful in order to motivate people. So when I took the job at London Youth Games, I inherited a strategy which was called double participation. And it's like, well, in some ways that's not a strategy, but I had to say it was because I had to get the job. And how are you going to get there is the strategy. And so if I were to, I suppose, leave one message on that, is articulating what your ambitions are, what social challenge you're trying to address, how good looks like. It's really useful to motivate people. Sometimes I underestimate that. It's helpful for the trustees, for funders to have an idea of what it is that success looks like. But I think conflating that with what is your strategy is one of the most dangerous things people do. A good strategy takes your hardest business challenge and provides a blueprint for the answer. If you're a really large organization, that blueprint might be quite sketchy. For a small organization, it might be really, really tangible at every level. They're both strategies. It's not that your strategy versus a work stream versus a task, etc., is any different. They're just different zoom levels of what it is you're going to do to address your biggest challenge. So where we sit today at Speakers Trust, we have absolutely no lack of demand for what we do from schools. What we have is a challenge in getting people to fund that to happen, because it's discretionary for schools. It's got nothing. So how do we address the challenge of unlimited demand, but really limited resources to be able to deliver that? And it's not one silver bullet to do it. That may be, again, as another challenge in defining strategy, but we need to create a business model and structure that addresses that core challenge, so driving down the administration cost of what we're doing, how we use tech to do that, of being able to clearly evidence the impact that we're having with young people and be able to demonstrate that to funders so that the long-term impact is seen and they're more willing to fund it. So how do we create an engine that touches on every aspect of what we do, that solves the fundamental challenge that we see as having as an organization? The hardest bit is really defining what that is. So if I go back to London Youth Games, our strategy wasn't to double participation. That was our desired outcome. Our strategy was by reinventing the way that the program was delivered, by changing it from a fully staffed event model to being a program of activity that was led by young people. That created a massive volunteer program. It also meant that we changed the fundamental outcomes of what we did, because those young people transferring along that volunteer program was a massive outcome of what we did. But from that, we were able to change a program that delivered to 25,000 young people to one that delivered to 100,000 young people. So we ticked the box. We succeeded in achieving growth, but growth wasn't a strategy. Growth was an outcome. And I think learning to really love the processes that are involved in trying to achieve that, understanding what problem you're solving. And our problem back at London Youth Games was you just couldn't scale up with the model that we had. You couldn't get qualified people to do half the roles, but you also couldn't create an environment that people want to be part of. So how could you reinvent what you did in order to achieve that? That to me was the strategy.
Brilliant. And I think it's looking back on that period now, I think it's really interesting talking about that, because I know how hung up people were on the doubling. Not you, but like we all knew that if you asked certain members of our board, if you asked our funders, they would tell you the strategy was to grow the games, to make it much more accessible and to da-da-da-da. But and it's not because we didn't tell them, but it's definitely the bit that, you know, quite often, you know, you say you underestimate sometimes that ability to motivate, and that's definitely true of stuff, but I also think it's true of some of your partners. Sometimes what they're interested in is what you're painting the future of. And I think it took them a long time. They got it in the end, but it took them a long time. And I just remember conversation after conversation where we'd be like, do they not get it? And they didn't. And it just, I think you have to be very patient around people understanding. But unless, I remember, again, really good example, Russell, of something that you did that stayed with me forever and stayed with the other person. So I used to work with someone called Helen when we worked for Russell. And I remember Russell saying to us, right, Helen ran the volunteer program at the beginning. And I remember Russell saying to us, your ambition, your goal this summer is that you can sit in an event in the corner and not move. That your volunteer teams can do everything you need them to do. And and it might not be possible, but that's as much as possible. And so thinking about how the goals that we had reflected on the strategy that we had set, that you had set, versus what we were telling everybody externally, I think was really, really interesting. Like it completely changed how we saw what we were trying to do. It was amazing. It still sticks with me. Okay. So one of the things we've talked about a lot over the last sessions is how do we involve teams more in everything, really? Thinking about their organization, facilitating connection, lots of different ways. So it would be absolutely a lunch and learn session if we didn't ask. So we're talking about strategy and planning. how do you engage the team and the people around you in talking or thinking about it or understanding it?
For me, the first thing, I talk about what is strategy is just the accumulation of every task you do every day. That's your strategy. And I think the most important thing to start with is everything, particularly in a small organization, but everything people are doing is making a difference to the outcome of what you do. So every decision they're making, every small aspect is a contributor to your strategy. And so framing it as that emergent property or that accumulation of everything you're doing and how you're trying to achieve it is really important because they're connected. So it's not top down of we're trying to double participation, that's our mission, and therefore you are doing this. But it's you are actually designing and developing the strategy, the actual strategy rather than the desired strategy every day with what you're doing. And then you're really close to the problem and to the challenges. Any blueprint, any strategic blueprint is just that. It's literally what an architect takes in to try and go and get a builder to build what they're doing, but it's the builders who create the building. And I think shifting that from it's the blueprint to what's the project management, what's the delivery, that starts informing people that they are constantly impacting the strategy of the organization. So there's a buy-in there. And then when you get the opportunity to reflect, it's taking that connection the other way. So, firstly, it's really understanding what I would call the business ecosystem. So, at London Youth Games, again, to use that as an example, yes, the outcome, the desired outcome at the heart of what we were doing is we want to grow the games. I'm not a big believer in putting labels on, but yes, double participation was the first one. But what would be charities use logic models or theories of change. What's the theory of change? And this to me is where people can really have an impact. And one part of that was we need to be at the heart of sport in London. And what that meant is every governing body had to see the relevance of what we were doing to them and their outcomes. And when I started, I got a report and it was everybody loves it, but they all see it as an outdated local authority sports competition. But the way we were going to get way more resource than we'd ever had before was by getting the governing bodies all engaged in what we were doing. Now, that is a statement of what we're trying to achieve. But actually, the people who were working with me were the ones who were like, well, this is how we do that for this organization. This is how we make it relevant to tennis. This is how we make it relevant to athletics. Now, seeing that how you're doing those aspects of the job is actually the strategy, because that's connecting to the bigger picture of we need to create a model where we are delivering 4 times as many events or to 4 times as many people. We are making sure that we are sustainable longer term because there are different sources of not just money funding, but resources coming in, that we've got governing bodies who want their officials to be able to deliver our event. They prioritize the calendaring of our event. So I think the important bit is to have that understanding of how the bits of the organization, even a small organization, but the elements you're doing are interrelated and combining. And then at that point, people can question either the outcome, they can question how those bits, how those cogs work together, or what's the best way of optimizing each individual cog. And I think at that point, getting everybody in the team, getting volunteers, getting others involved in strategic conversations moves away from what I see as the biggest danger of that, which is we all would wordsmith our vision just that little bit differently. And if that's how people are getting people involved in strategy of how should we call ourselves, what should our tagline be, what should the big audacious goal, as they call it, or the quantifiable outcome that we're desiring, that's at the wrong level, and that's abstract. Whereas what people can really do is start saying how you can build your ecosystem of your organization to be way better, and that'll be the outcome.
Yeah, my bugbear too, that one. I think that's it's a really, really important thing to reflect on. Okay, so we've talked about this topic a lot, so I'm going to ask, like, money's always tight, right? We all dream about having more budgets to be able to do things for the people in our teams and things like that. How do you keep your team motivated and inspired and engaged on a limited budget? What are the tricks you use?
So I pause for a moment. One of the biggest lessons I've had is just moving from the commercial sector into the voluntary sector is the challenge of HR is done so much better by charities and voluntary organizations, because that's the purest form of motivation. If you take money off the table for a volunteer, how can you make their experience awesome? Trying to take that into how you work with your team, to me, is the way that you can take the amazing lessons that people have in the voluntary sector and build it in to paid staff. So here's an example of something I think worked well with volunteers. So again, and it sounds like Jane and I are going down memory lane, but with volunteers at London Youth Games, we get a load of people who were volunteering at the games for the very first time. And they could be asked questions by 3,000 people on site. They wouldn't know the answer. And you had this sort of need for, please don't ask them hard questions. It's like a learner's badge for a volunteer. Now, how can you rethink that? How can you rethink what's the one time that somebody who's new to an organization is most valued? And I go back to my football days of the new signing. The time that people are most hyped about somebody new joining the organization is your brand new £50 million striker who signs for you. So changing that I'm new, don't ask me difficult questions badge into a new signing badge that was all celebratory helped everyone on the volunteer team understand where they were. It made them feel special because they were a new signing. They weren't a new starter or an inexperienced member of the team. But that's just a way of reframing what motivates people. And I think taking that sort of philosophy into the workplace of thinking what's actually going on beyond money in terms of motivation and what do they want to see from me. So my biggest volunteer role that I absolutely adored was handing out water. And if the volunteers see you take routine jobs and make them fun, then that's where they can get a buzz. And I think that translates to paid staff as well. So that back to the floor exercise, the engaging in the mundane, the routine, and making the best out of them and celebrating those small wins as you go, to me, taps into people's motivation way beyond how much you're paying them. Everyone needs to pay their rent. But if I were to, throw one more book, it's Drive by Daniel Pink, I think is a great aspect of how you're tapping into the psychology of what truly motivates people beyond needing to pay the rent.
Love that book. Pay people enough to take money off the table and then motivate them with the things that they really care about. And I love that part of his book. Okay, we've got a minute left, so we're just about to finish up. But before we do, we always ask as a closing question, a lot of emerging leaders and aspiring managers and leaders in the community that we're serving. What's your top tip? What's your advice to them going forward?
I'll tell you the thing I'm rubbish at. I think the thing I'd love to have been better at and still is looking after yourself. One of the great books that I read that's informed how I work is Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. What I feel, and I think my lesson from that is you need to follow a book with Leaders Still Eat. And I think that maybe for me is the one thing as you take on more and more responsibility and accountability for the results, is remembering you're also only human. You may look after everybody else. You may put on their oxygen masks first. Don't forget to put on your oxygen mask.
That is very, very wise words, and definitely words that I probably would have done better earlier in my career if I truly understood. So that's it for today's session. Thank you so much for joining us, Russell. Lots in there. With your permission, we'll be clipping some of that up as well to share with the audience so that those who weren't with us today because they're busy delivering to schools will be able to access.